Goals for this module. Explain copyright for original creations. Explain the Creative Commons license. Explain when to obtain permission to use others' work. You can copyright original material you created. This includes written work, work that you write. This could include poetry, prose, technical manuals, and any other writings you can put on paper or a digital screen can be copyrighted as long as you created it. You can also copyright multimedia. This includes audio, video, and images. Your creations are your intellectual property. You own it. You own all the rights to the use of your intellectual property. You can govern how your intellectual property is used. You can choose to sell the movie rights, for example, to your work. You can sell translation rights, magazine rights, and a whole host of other rights, including broadcasting rights. The list goes on, but these are some of the more basic ones. As such, because you own the intellectual property you've created, and because it is your creation, you can copyright your intellectual property. We already mentioned that a copyright gives you all the rights to your intellectual property and that you own all the rights. A copyright protects your IP by allowing you to restrict who can use your work. You can restrict how users can use your work. For instance, you can restrict them to non-commercial use. You can give them only the translation rights, only the movie rights. You can allow them to broadcast the material, etc. You can also require others to get permission from you to use your work. That is, they need to specify how they want to use it and what rights they need, and you then provide that permission in writing, or you deny the permission according to your wishes. The nice thing about copyrights is that they protect your work for your entire life plus 75 years after you die. For most of us, that's a pretty long time when you consider that could be well over 120 years total or more. However, for maximum protection, you need to register your copyright with the U.S. Copyright Office and include a notice on your work that it is in fact copyrighted. An easy way to manage copyright permissions is to license your work. And one way to license your work is to use what is called a Creative Commons license. You still own the IP and copyright that you are licensing when you use Creative Commons. Creative Commons allows you to specify the rights you grant users under the license. And users recognize you by giving your work attribution when they use it. So it's a win-win for everybody. You allow others to use your work with the restrictions you specify, and you get recognition by giving your work the attribution by having users give your work the attribution it deserves. As I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of licensing your material using the Creative Commons license is that you control the rights granted and the conditions of use of your material that you give to your users. So you have as the graphic shows, you have a range of openness you can choose for your users. By far the most open of the licenses is the CC BY license. It merely requires that the user give attribution to you for using your work. As I said, it's the most open. It's the most suitable for uses like education, commercial use, and other types of usage because it has no restriction other than requiring you to give credit to the user where credit is due. One of the benefits of the CC BY license is that it allows you to create derivative works. A derivative work is a work that is based on the material you borrowed from. So if I were to create a derivative work of the graphic shown here on this slide, I might choose a gradient color that goes from green to yellow as I go towards the bottom of the arrow from the top. So it starts out very green and ends up very yellow with different shades of yellow-green in between to further illustrate the progressive restrictiveness of the content. That would be an example of a derivative work. Also, because I'm a CC BY license is the least restrictive, as I said, I can also use it for commercial work as well as for derivative works. So it makes it ideal for uses in education and commercial use. As we said earlier, you can apply a number of restrictions to the use of your materials, and one such restriction is the share alike condition. This requires you to license any derivative works you make based on the material you're borrowing back to the community under the same equivalent license as the original user's work. This is kind of an example of, it's really more of a copyleft sort of usage because it requires you to give back to the community what you borrowed, including your enhancements. So a share alike basically requires you to license your content derived from the share alike licensed material under a similar license so that others can make derivative works off of your works. A further restriction you can apply to the use of your content is the no derivatives condition. This means that a user cannot create a derivative work based on your work. That is, they can only use the work the way you have created it, as is, in other words. Yes, they can enlarge it or shrink it to fit the space that they're using it in, but they cannot create a derivative work by, say, changing the colors, for instance, or changing the fonts or any other type of effect that they might choose to use. They would have to use it as is, other than perhaps for resizing it. The last condition is the non-commercial condition. A content license with the non-commercial condition may not be used in commercial or business settings. However, a nonprofit could be defined, depending on the jurisdiction, as a commercial or non-commercial entity. For that, you'd have to seek counsel. That might be kind of a murky thing, but if you really want to be the safest, even a nonprofit should probably not use content flagged with the non-commercial condition. Consult your legal counsel regarding any of these types of situations. we've covered the Creative Commons license and its benefits for content creators. There are also benefits for you as a user. As we said, it's a quick way to get content when you're under the gun for use in your school projects or business work. So just remember when you're using, in the case of business projects, you cannot, they must not be flagged for non-commercial use. Otherwise, there is good content there that you can use and save yourself lots of time when you're in a time situation. We've mentioned attribution as one of the conditions for using Creative Commons licensed content in our works. And attribution is nothing more than giving credit where credit is due. You may remember your English teachers telling you that you must give credit in the form of a citation in your bibliography for using someone else's ideas. Well, the same is true when using someone else's content on the web. You need to give them credit where credit is due, and that is called an attribution. In the slides we've been in this presentation, you'll notice that all of the image content that I used had an attribution underneath. I've enlarged the attribution for this particular image so we can look at it in more detail and see why it is a good way to attribute and see what we can learn from this. Let's take a look at the anatomy of an ideal attribution under the CC licensing. This attribution shown here under the image is ideal because it contains the title of the image, or the title of the content. In this case, for Gellin Afterglow. It includes the author. It tells us that it's by Lucas. I'm not going to try to pronounce that German name. And you might notice that the author's name is hyperlinked with a link to their profile page, presumably where the image is located or where one can find this image. Finally, we have the source of the image, which is, again, the title is hyperlinked, so that way you know how to get to the actual image itself. You have the author's profile under the byline, and finally you have the license, that is the Creative Commons license and its version number with a link to the legal document, the legal license document. In this case, the image is licensed under the Creative Commons by with no derivatives, the no derivatives restriction, and it's version 2.0 of the license. So you have all the information needed there. Now there could be other things. If there was share alike, you would have the SA indication in the license title there in the link. This one has the only restriction it has is no derivative. Again, you have share alike, the SA, which we covered earlier, and the no commercial or NC condition. Again, we covered both of those earlier, but you can have a combination of those indicated in the link here. Permission is not required for fair use. Fair use of copyrighted material from other users is considered material that, number one, is a small amount of material typically used to substantiate points you make in a research paper or to illustrate a point in your own work. So it is the key thing is that it's a very small amount of work. Fair use includes using brief quotations of text. Typically, you're looking at text of less than 300 words. The idea is you're using text to substantiate a claim that you've made in a research paper, or similar sorts of things where you're using another author's works to perhaps a subject matter expert's work to substantiate and support the points that you make in your own work. You can also use an illustration, audio or video clip to illustrate points you need to make in your own content. Typically, these come from collections, although they might be individual items that are licensed under Creative Commons use or that you've licensed from other individuals or companies. Again, the most common licensed material will be Creative Commons license, just because it's easier to use and the permissions are indicated in the works. Please note that if you're using larger amounts of work, you do need permission from the owner of the work to use it. A good rule of thumb is when in doubt, get permission. So always pay attention to the amount of work you use, and if it's a substantial amount or a large amount of work, more than you'd use in a brief quotation or to illustrate a point, make sure you get permission from the copyright owner. Whenever the amount of copyrighted content you use exceeds fair use, you must get permission to use that content from the copyright owner. Failure to do so puts you at risk of copyright infringement, and there are severe penalties for committing copyright infringement. We'll talk about those in a moment. For larger amounts of text, typically more than you would use for a citation, you would need to get permission. If you're reproducing, say, a chunk of text from a book in your own material, you would need permission. It's every so often I run into papers or materials where a creator has received permission to use large amounts of material, like a partial chapter of a book, or 4 or 5 paragraphs of text to substantiate or illustrate a point they're making. Again, for those large amounts of text, you do need to get permission from the copyright owner. If you're using a number of illustrations that are copyrighted by a specific owner, it's always a good idea to get permission to make sure that you're in the clear. For that sort of thing, 1 or 2 you can probably get away with, but typically it's always a safe bet to get permission, or as we've said before, use Creative Commons licensed work where the permission is already given to you in the license. However, using substantial amounts of text or illustrations is not the only reason for getting permission. If you're using any substantial portion of a work, you need permission from the copyright owner. That includes videos, video clips, movie clips, audio clips, and other media. So it goes beyond text and illustrations. So anytime you use substantial portions, as we've said, you must get permission to ensure you are not infringing on someone else's copyright, and that comes from the owner. Typically, you'll indicate to the owner in your query what materials you wish to use, the purpose of your use, and whether or not it's commercial use. And they should provide you written response either one way or the other. If in doubt, don't use it or use Creative Commons material. I can't stress how important it is to ensure you take every precaution to ensure you do not infringe on copyright. When in doubt, you must get permission from the copyright owner before using any copyrighted work. So if there's any chance you think you're going beyond fair use, err on the side of caution and get permission from the copyrighted owner. As you'll see on the next slides, the copyright infringement does carry some severe penalties. Copyright infringement occurs when you use someone else's work in your own material without permission. It doesn't make any difference what kind of material it is. Uh, as we said, copyright applies to all kinds of materials, text, images, audio, video, etc. So that infringement occurs when you use large amounts of work without permission. Because you use material that belongs to someone else doesn't necessarily automatically create copyright infringement. We mentioned that the copyright law does allow for fair use, which means using small amounts of material in your own work to illustrate a point or to substantiate a claim in your work or to support uh, an argument you're making in your work. However, copyright infringement does occur when you go beyond fair use and use more than is considered fair use without permission. And that's the key point. Using more, going beyond fair use is what puts you in risk of copyright infringement. Another way to infringe on copyright is to violate the terms of your use license. If you license material and you violate the terms of the license, you can be held in, you can be charged with infringement of copyright legally. So that includes software licenses, such as the software you license, like Microsoft products and Apple products. It could include violating the Creative Commons license that comes with material that is so licensed, and other license agreements. So to avoid copyright infringement, you must respect the licenses that come with your material, whether it's Creative Commons or other licensing. If you need something that is not covered by your license, again, get permission from the copyright owner to ensure that you cover your tail legally. As you can see, the penalties for copyright infringement are very severe. For each work you infringe, you can expect a fine of anywhere from $750 to $30,000, plus court costs and attorney fees. So you can see it's pretty expensive, and this is per work infringed. So if you infringe 10 works, you can see the cost would add up very quickly. So do your due diligence. It's a lot less expensive. The easiest way to avoid copyright infringement is to only use what is permitted by fair use law. This is especially important if you don't have the time or to actually get permission from the copyright owner to use more extensive work. Sticking to fair use, what is allowed by fair use law is the safest way to proceed. If you need more material to use from a copyrighted work than fair use provides, you must get the owner's permission. There's no other way to avoid copyright infringement. You must get the owner's permission and then follow the permissions you've been given. If you've been denied the extensive use you want, you just have to come up with another alternative. Again, copyright infringement is just too expensive to do it any other way. Finally, use properly licensed work and follow the terms of the license. That is another way to avoid copyright infringement. Again, if getting permission is a hassle, using Creative Commons licensed content and following the terms of the particular Creative Commons license attached to the work is an excellent way to both save time and have your permission in writing without a lot of hassle on your part. And that's going to be the recommended way when you're on a budget, unless you have the time to create your own graphics and media and other content. So I hope this helps you understand how to avoid copyright infringement and how to avoid getting into legal trouble. In this module, you learned about and should now be able to explain what is intellectual copyright and what is copyright, what copyright infringement is and the penalties for copyright infringement, what is considered fair use of copyrighted material and what fair use law is all about, when to get permission to use copyrighted works, when you must get permission, and finally, how to use creative licensed content for your projects.